The Middle East has become a hotbed of conflict with pro-Iranian militias in the Gaza Strip. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq and Yemen in this tense situation. Iran's policies, especially in Iraq and Syria, have challenged the joint Israeli-US cooperation since the beginning of the war. US troops in Iraq and Syria have been attacked nearly 150 times by Iranian-linked militants since the Israel-Gaza war began in October. Pressure on President Joe Biden to respond militarily despite political sensitivities in Baghdad. Most recently, Iranian forces carried out an unexpected airstrike against a military base.
Ремень отпустите, извините его, что он был длиннее. Когда он на шею повесили, вот автомат был не возле подбородка.
The US retaliation in Iraq has made even Iran regret its policies in the region. Let's go to the Iraq-Syria borderline, where the action is taking place, and discover how the clashes are affecting the current state of the war. In the Middle East, first of all, treacherous attacks by pro-Iranian armed groups on US bases in Iraq have raised tensions in the region. Washington sources reported that several drones targeted an air base in Iraq where US troops are stationed, causing injuries and damage. Several attack drones belonging to pro-Iranian militants were observed at the Al-Assad base in western Anbar province, and Iraqi security officials. Drone was shot down as it tried to target the base. In a statement, the resistance in Iraq, a loose alliance of Iranian-linked armed groups, claimed the responsibility for 2 drone attacks on the base on Tuesday, saying they were acting in support of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The same base was targeted by at least a dozen missiles last Saturday. White House Deputy National Security Advisor John Fair said Sunday that the attack was very serious and that pro-Iranian militias used ballistic missiles to target the base, which poses a real threat. Washington officials announced that the United States had launched air strikes against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq in retaliation for the ballistic missiles fired at the Asaya air base, which left 4 US personnel with traumatic brain injuries. At President Biden's directions, US military forces carried out necessary and proportionate strikes against 3 facilities in Iraq used by Iranian-backed Hezbollah and other Iran-aligned groups. The airstrikes allegedly hit an arms shipment and the warehouse near Abu Kamal, where pro-Iranian groups maintain a significant presence. It also emerged that a US airstrike near the Iraqi border in eastern Syria targeted a truck and a convoy carrying weapons. The Pentagon said the strike on the killed a militia leader responsible for recent attacks on US military personnel. In Iraq, in addition, the UK-based Syrian Observatory of Human Rights said that 2 non-Syrian Iranian-backed militants killed in possible US airstrikes targeting at least 1 weapons truck on the outskirts of Abu Kamal in the eastern countryside of Iraq. At least 3 other militants were wounded, and the death toll is expected to rise. According to the observatory, these precision strikes were perceived as a direct response to a series of escalating tensions. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said in a statement that operations will continue to counter attacks by Iranian-backed militias against us and coalition personnel in Syria and Iraq. These latest strikes on the Iraqi border came at a time when Israel, an ally of the United States, has intensified its attacks since October 7th, launching at least 46 strikes on Syrian territory, killing Iranian-linked militants, including senior commanders of the revolutionary movement since mid-October. American troops and bases in Iraq and Syria have been subjected to more than 140 rocket and drone attacks by Iranian-backed Iraqi militants, according to Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh. In response, the United States has launched at least 15 strikes against pro-Iranian militias in Diord since the start of the Israel-Gaza war. At least 27 militants have been killed and heavy material losses have been suffered. All these attacks and situations in the region have raised serious concerns within the Iraqi government. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shait al-Sudani called for the international coalition to leave the country, saying that the deployment must end to ensure national security. There are about 500 US troops in Iraq and about 900 in Syria. But at such a critical time, US troops are not expected to withdraw from either Iraq or Syria in the event of a withdrawal. Washington probably believes that Iran would turn the Middle East into a huge arena for chaotic conflicts. The US military presence in the region has therefore become a clear obligation as a clearly realizable military mission. However, by tolerating threats to troops, US policy authorizes adversaries in the region to impose costs on any actions the US takes. To advance its interests, this authority means that previous US objectives that led to these deployments, such as supporting humanitarian operations and competing against great power rivals, may be better served through alternative strategies that do not require permanent ground forces in Iraq and Syria. However, while the US should reserve the right to repel and retaliate against attacks in Iraq and Syria, it is unclear whether this provides any deterrence. For example, the deployment of the AK-130 warship by US forces to repel an Assad attack has still not prevented Iranian proxies from attacking US forces. Nevertheless, the United States is uniquely capable of launching over-the-horizon strikes against credible threats, but for us, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance and strike capabilities to be reliable and effective, ground troops do not need to be located in vulnerable, isolated positions such as the Alan garrison in southern Syria. Even without ground troops in Iraq and Syria, the US is still seen as being able to rely on a large military contingent. In such a situation, the US could fully utilize its basing options, including air and naval bases in Turkey, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Yemen, and Qatar. But another justification for us forces in Syria, especially those in Alan, was the claim that their presence disrupts Iran's regional influence by denying them access to the Mediterranean Sea. However, the ability of Iranian proxies to sustain the current level of violence against US forces at escalating levels for months on end suggests that Iranian supplies are not meaningfully prohibited. These groups remain capable and well supplied for years. In 2018, in response to the strengthening of Pro-Iranian armed groups, Israel felt threatened enough to drop 2,000 lb of ammunition on Iranian-backed forces near the Syrian border. The US, on the other side, also senses the risks and is constantly deploying different missions in the region. It is not clear how the current military mission to disrupt Iranian proxy networks can be plausibly carried out, or whether the increased risks to vulnerable US forces gives Iran more leverage against Iran. Proponents of continued US deployment in Syria also point to the US goal of alleviating the humanitarian crisis in Syria and providing security for the delivery of humanitarian aid. Alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people is a worthy goal, but it is more affected by US sanctions policy than by the presence of US forces on the ground. Another argument in favor of keeping US troops in Iraq and Syria is that both countries are key battlegrounds in the larger competition with great power rivals such as Russia and China. Such arguments need a historical and global perspective. Russia's influence and military footprint in Syria has certainly expanded since its intervention in 2015. Moscow has had a long-standing security relationship with the country. Since the 1950s, the Russians have access to the Mediterranean port of Tartus. Russian-Syrian security ties will inevitably continue in 1971 on a broader scale if greater power competition is the reason for continued deployments in Iraq and Syria. Us policymakers need to take a broader view given its over-the-horizon capabilities. The US does not need to give its adversaries easy opportunities to harm US troops in order to defend against threats to core regional interests. The US urgently needs to de-risk its footprint in the Middle East, rather than hoping that redeploying missions in Iraq and Syria is no longer worth years of risk in a de-risk environment. The US is likely to be much more effective in the region. Thank you for watching us. We work day and night to bring you the fastest and most reliable news in order not to miss the videos prepared by our team, including the latest developments and special reports on the conflict in the Middle East and all over the world. You can subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and click the super thanks button below. See you in our next work.